thoughts. Okay, so now we're going to move on to discussing parts 3 and 4 of the book. Obviously, the real world has intervened, and that is, we are going to try to keep that in mind as we talk about parts 3 and 4. Now, obviously, part 3 was some specific issues, and I just wanted to start with a win for this idea of framing, and he talked about it in the book. And obviously, the book was updated in 2014 before the Obergefell decision in the Supreme Court that made gay marriage legal across the land. But you could still see it. Living in California, I know all about. I was all about Prop 8. That was the big thing in 2008, and the win for framing that progressives, once progressives switched to the love is love, commitment, marriage is commitment, and these people just want to commit to each other, that framing, we saw how fast it changed. I remember in 2008 when the main arguments that liberals were using were, well, it's all about rights, and they want to be able to just visit their partner in the hospital and things like that, and the rights that a marriage gives. That didn't work. And what did work was changing it to that framing of love and commitment and the sanctity of marriage. And he talks about that in the book. And obviously, as we see now, it worked, and it worked quickly, less than 10 years. So if anyone has any thoughts about that, gay marriage in particular, I wanted to start with that one because it's a positive, it's a win, and it's something that we saw how it worked. And yes, we do have the raise hand feature in the chat box at the bottom. You can see that, or in the chat options. When you go to chat options, you can use that as well if you want to talk, and we will see that pop up, and we can unmute you and you can say your piece. So does anybody have any thoughts about the gay marriage framing? Yes, no? I know it's a win, right? No one wants to talk about the good stuff. So Amar had some thoughts about it, but what about you guys? The question about what progressive framing or messaging should we be using as we engage in conversations about racial justice and equity? I want to hear your thoughts too. We want to hear your thoughts. I think this is a conversation that is going to be really helpful to have, especially as we go out into the world to try to talk to people about it. So please raise your hand. We will unmute you. We can talk about it. I know you have to have thoughts. Okay, Georgine Redman raised her hand, or comment in chat, that's true.
Okay, my question is when I was reading a lot about George Floyd's murder, one thing that I heard that really registered with me was we're always talking about Black injustice and the Black problem, and someone said this really isn't a Black problem, it's a white problem. And to me, that was reframing it. And so I just would like to know what people's thoughts on that are.
Good question. Anyone have any thoughts? I mean, I do, but I don't want to just talk this whole time. This isn't my thing. Erin hand. Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
We were just talking about this with a couple of people from Building Bridges a couple of nights ago. My mom framed white privilege well for me. that because people get offended, they get angry. A white person's reaction to hearing the phrase white privilege is often, I've worked hard for everything I have, nothing's ever been handed to me. White privilege is not having things handed to you. It's not having roadblocks put in front of you that other people face. And I think that that's a way to frame it that turns the phrase on its head. It's not about you getting a handout. It's you not having consistent roadblocks stuck in front of you because of the color of your skin.
Yep. I like that a lot. Your mom is a smart woman. Anyone else? Gemma?
Hi, how you going? Sorry,
Good. Go ahead.
I'm on my phone, which means I can only see one thing at a time. I can either see the chat or I can see the
Right.
the mute button. Anyway, what I was just going to say that there's a bit of work that's been done on race by a communications consultant in the States that I'm very interested in, which has tested messages around a race class narrative. So you can speak, if you're speaking to a white audience. I mean, I don't know what audience has been tested on, so I only know it was tested on white audiences. It may have been tested on all sorts of audiences, but the successful narrative was the idea that the powers that be, the 1%, they are trying to turn us against each other on purpose. It is not just the natural way of things. It's not just an unfortunate, sad situation that's come out of nowhere. This whole thing is orchestrated when people come out with these racist messages in order to turn people against each other and hide the fact that they are essentially stealing our wealth.
Oh, okay.
I guess so. Try and find the link to that research and pop it in the chat if people want to have a look at that.
That would be great.
It's more about like talking about a strategy rather than so it seems to work when people understand they're being manipulated.
Yes. Yeah, and I think that ties back into the book and framing, because if you frame it in a way where people realize that they are being manipulated, it tends to maybe open their mind.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's not really the right phrase, but yeah. So.
Okay, I found it. I'll post it in the chat now.
Great, thank you. Okay. Did anyone else want to say anything about, obviously there's racial justice and police reform are huge issues, and we're not going to solve it in a half-hour discussion in a book club, but Marilyn has her hand raised. Marilyn D, you got that? Hi, Marilyn. Is she unmuted? All right, you're unmuted, Marilyn. Go ahead. Marilyn, you're unmuted. Go ahead. She's on the phone, so it might not be showing up. Okay. No, she muted herself again, so all right. We will go on. Let's see. There we go. All right, so Gemma put the link to that research in chat if you didn't see that. And then David, do you want to talk about that? Oh, the gay marriage thing a little bit? We can go back.
Yeah. What I wanted to suggest is, if for anybody who hasn't researched the issue, because I live in Massachusetts, and a very good friend of mine, was very close to this issue and is one of the people who was photographed in the Boston Globe as one of the first couples getting married under this under the gay marriage law in Massachusetts. And I just want to recommend reading Margaret Marshall's beautifully written majority opinion, because basically what she and the judges that were part of the majority were writing about is they basically made the legal case for gay marriage basically following the intention of what the legislatures wrote, because Massachusetts history in terms of the law is very interesting, because it was one of the first constitutions to get rid of God, one of the first state constitutions to eliminate the state religion, which is something that many of the founders were strong advocates for, right? And I just wanted to remind that I get into a lot of conversations with conservatives who go on and on and on about how this is a Christian nation. And I go, well, it's more complicated than that, because our founders really wanted to get religion out of the public sphere. Not that it wasn't an important thing and a great moral guide, and an ethical life is important, but in terms of public discourse, we would never get anywhere. So it's interesting that, and George Lakoff talks about this a lot in the book, which is very interesting in terms of, you go back to our founders, and yes, they had a lot of problems. They weren't perfect, but what's fascinating is they did frame a system that is deeply progressive. And so I go back to our founders, especially Thomas Paine and agrarian justice, which is the philosophical foundation of Social Security. I go back to the founders to find roots, because if people really want to talk about originalism and original intent, then I go, yeah, let's go to the original intent. If you want to go there, let's go there, because you find a lot of these progressive values in our founding documents and in the battles that were waged politically from the very beginning. Because we're not going to get anywhere quoting progressive activists or partisans. That's not going to get us anywhere. But going back to basics, I have found to be productive, and George Lakoff provides a really good guide for how to frame those discussions. But Margaret Marshall's decision is really beautiful. It's one of the most beautiful pieces of legal writing that I've read myself.
To look it up. It's interesting what you say about going back to the source. It's something I've noticed a lot in this last week is a lot of white people quoting Martin Luther King, either in or out of context, mostly out of context, and not really understanding the work or intention behind it, and not really understanding, you can kind of tell when they quote it that they haven't studied the actual civil rights movement. And I've been trying really hard every time I see someone post a meme with like half of a Martin Luther King Jr. quote to not push back, but to use Dr. King's words, a full portion of the speech, or saying, okay, he did say the riot is the language of the unheard, but here's the whole context of that quote and what he was talking about, and how we differentiate between understanding why something happens and condoning it. And it is something that is it's subtle, but it's something that Dr. King did very well. And, you can see that he explains that he understands why rioting happens. It is very understandable, but it doesn't say he condones it. And he never, and so what people are saying, they're quoting, oh, Dr. King would never do this. I'm like, well, he won't condone it, but he understands why it happens. So yeah, exactly. And there, Thomas put the quote in the chat. So yeah, and like Christy said, it's viewed as white people appropriating Black work. Just make sure when you're retweeting or quoting Black authors, activists, whatever, you don't try to appropriate it for yourself. Just let them speak. Thomas Tenorio has his hand up. Can you unmute him?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, there we go.
So I think MLK was a master at shifting gears. Unfortunately, in the politician that came on earlier, he immediately started talking about the riot. I mean, my earlier comment was, don't think of a riot. I mean, if we're going to follow Lakoff, you really got to shift gears, and that's what MLK would do. Mm-hmm. He was asked to explain why riots were occurring and to condemn them, and he then turned it on to a discussion about humanity and why things are happening. I still think that we continue to think about dialogue, the rhetoric of the left, and in ways that persuade us, but actually have absolutely no effect on the other side. So.
Okay. Actually, that's a really, oh, okay, Marilyn. Let's try again with Marilyn. Okay, I will, once you unmute her, okay, yeah.
Hello.
Hi, Marilyn.
Oh, hi. Long time listener, first time caller. Wow, that was excellent. Oh, well, I wanted to say that the first person was asking about the framing of the George Floyd murder, and I think she hit the nail on the head by just calling it for what it is, a murder. And I know I could totally identify. I know people that really get irritated when you say white privilege and they're white, or they're kind of, just kind of sick of hearing the same terms over and over again, racial injustice. And some are even like, I already know about racial history. I've studied it, right? But when you call it a murder and we keep saying that, like, I think that's more relatable, I guess. You could understand that more than just using terms from college. And then I noticed too that like the conservatives seem to be taking over the narrative where, initially it started off as a peaceful protest. And now what you see in headlines is riots and looting. And it's like, once they've already like started to use that wording, I mean, how do we take that back? Do we just, keep pushing? No, it's a protest, or try not to use their wording? It's sort of like that example that they had in the book where it was the one president who said, I am not a crook, but hey, we're already thinking of you as a crook because you just said that. So do we stop from saying, no, it wasn't a riot or looting? That's what you hear, but it's a protest. So yeah, what do you think?
So actually, this is a really good segue into a couple of links we wanted to share. Wes has them, I think, and he's going to put them in chat. There have been, obviously, mostly mainstream media, if you've been watching, they've been concentrating on the riots and the violence and showing the looting and things like that. Wes is putting these links in here. There have been some media outlets that have been doing a really excellent job with framing. And there was an article in Slate. There was an article in Vox. There's a couple articles in Vox. Vox is doing a really good job. I would suggest if you have any extra pennies that you would like to donate to good journalism, they're doing an excellent job this week framing this as police violence erupting. They had an article that was only talked about the peaceful marches and demonstrations for against police brutality. And they didn't mention the riots at all in that article. They mentioned only the peaceful protests, and they had the pictures of the peaceful protests. That's the kind of thing that we want to start amplifying, I think. Yeah. And yeah, the only riot is your description of the protest. That's true. And so Slate talks about the other side of it is there has been a lot of, the mainstream media doesn't really talk about it, is how many of these incidents are actually started by police showing up in riot gear and tear gassing people. Well, if you tear gas someone, do you expect them to fight back? Yes. So not that I'm saying that I condone the rioting or the violence, but there are different ways to frame it. and some media outlets are doing a good job. We just need to find them and elevate those. So Wes put some links in chat about it. Let's see, who else?
I believe Jimmy, I'm gonna unmute you.
Okay.
There you go, Jimmy.
Hey, you guys can hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I was thinking something interesting, sort of, about these police that are protesting with what would have been just the protesters, turning them into parades, turning them into very interesting events. One thing would be to just use the tough terminology, like these are brave police. These are the truly brave policemen. These are the courageous policemen. These are the ones who are loyal to their communities, and use a lot of the language that, because a lot of the language of the police and law enforcement is tough guy language. They're being tough. They got to be bad. They've got to be the strict father, as George Lakoff says, punishing people, and therefore, of course, calling it murder is good, but if you are, I think to some extent you can also co-opt some of that language and say it is braver. It is much braver to be a policeman, policewoman who actually says to your fellow police, you know what, this is messed up. We can do better. That's actual bravery, because we all know what it's like to have friends who are making fun of somebody or doing something that we kind of don't like, and we don't say anything, and we feel a little bit weaker as a result of that. But it's easier to just let it go. And this extends a little into white privilege. I know that as a white person, as a male, very often, like I have been in situations where I'm not proud of having let something slide. And quite frankly, it's up to us. It's up to a white person, a privileged person in any way, forget, it's not just white, it could be all sorts of things, who is in a situation where they can shut somebody down or they could turn it around a little bit because they have the most clout in that situation. And the same thing with the police. The police amongst each other have the most clout. And therefore the police that actually, like I saw that guy the sheriff take off his helmet and put down the baton and talk, to a whole community. Those are the people that I think are showing the most courage, because they're not just sort of leading a peaceful protest. They are showing the police standing behind them that it's okay to be doing that. That is the bravery that we want to see. We want people within the privileged communities to turn around and not just argue with people, not just argue with people they don't know, like arguing with your conservative uncle, but talking to even your slightly liberal friend who makes a weird comment, or, you're even catching yourself, or, it's really pay attention to what an actual brave thing is. Bravery is not just writing something on Facebook at an obviously opposing person. So
yes. Okay, so we want to respect everyone's time. It is 6:30 here. Well, 8:30. I'm sorry. It is 6:30 here, 9:30 there. And I want, we are scheduled for an hour, so we will stay on this Zoom if anyone wants to stay on and keep talking about this, ideas, that sort of thing. There's a lot of really good comments in the chat. We do save the chat, and so we will send it out so you can read it as well. If you need to go, feel free. I understand everyone's time is valuable, and if you want to stick around. We'll be here for about another 30 minutes talking. So feel free. And also I want to give a plug for next week. Wes, do you want to talk about next week?
Yeah, so next week we will be finishing with part 5 of the book, the last part. And then Nebraska State Senator Megan Hunt will be joining us for our question and answer. And I do want to, we try our best to make sure our guest speakers stick to Lakoff's work. So we apologize if things ever get off task for you, but we look forward to that discussion and look forward to you all joining us as well. So, and then also I'm going to put a link here in the chat. On Thursday, we do a grassroots discussion series. So that's not really book focused. And And we're going to be doing a 3-week series on how to build off Lacoste's work and continue to use those real world current day conversations. You know, like it was mentioned in the chat about having a list of words to use to help in that framing and messaging. So I'll drop that link in the chat and hope you can join us. So otherwise, I'm going to hand it back to Andy or anyone who wants to continue to stay on to discuss parts 3 and 4.
You caught me taking a drink of my pop. Sorry. Yeah, I'm from the Midwest. It's pop. So Christy, did you want to talk about that a little? Can you unmute, Christy? There you go. Now, go ahead, Christy.
Oh, are we talking about my little mini rant about white people being able to talk better?
Yes,
or
yes,
better,
no, do it.
But I guess in we are talking, and it's come up many times this weekend about who can say what. And while people aren't to my face saying you can't talk, and obviously, like Amar, I cannot speak to Black people and their experience, but I can talk about my experience. And I am married to a white man, and the difference between the level of respect and what I hear when I am alone and when I am with my husband are completely different. So I can also speak to the fact that I have spoken about white privilege for quite some time. And my husband, my guinea pig, has said that it didn't exist. And yet when a white male like Pete Buttigieg actually spoke passionately about white privilege and the need for reparations, all of a sudden my white husband was like, yeah, he makes a lot of sense. And I don't think the language was different. I think it was the messenger that was different. So I really think that when we say listen to the minorities and what they have to say, you absolutely should. But you've got to find your own voice and not just keep on repeating what other people are saying. You've got to figure out how to say it to white people. And it has to come from white people because they're not going to listen to us. You know, I see some other minorities in this room, and I'm sure they've experienced it as well. You know, and that's what's going to take the change is white people waking up, looking around and saying that something has to be said, and they're the ones who are going to have to say it.
And it looks like Jimmy just put a book in the link to a book in the chat about who's an effective messenger. So that's something you might want to check out. So we're reading this book, and then there's like links to 4 different other books that people want to read. Yeah, Tracy said, my brother thinks all the problems were solved in the 60s, which is a tough nut to crack. That is. My parents are, I was raised liberal. My parents have been Democrats their whole lives. My dad was a hippie. He lived in San Francisco in the late 60s and early 70s when it was going off. And he thinks that he still has some implicit bias that we're working through. It's hard when it's a 75-year-old man, you know? So.
Hey, it looks like Kaz has her hand raised. So Kaz, I'm
Sure.
going to unmute you.
Hey. Yeah, I just wanted to say to that, like, you know, it's like I do understand how, you know, people could be prideful that, you know, this happened in 1968 and, you know, we solved it, but, you know, they didn't. They papered things over. And you know that the core, the racism continued. So it's just like it's a really hard conversation because, like I said, they're very prideful. That you know it's a different kind of peace. You know, it's a different kind of way of defining peace. You know that it's a papered over piece, but it didn't actually solve the core issue. So it's just like that's tough to bring up to somebody, like I said, who's been very proud of what they were able to do in the 60s, and to now come to them and say, we need you to actually go further. We need to actually go deeper and actually solve these systemic problems and not just paper them over.
Yeah, that is a good phrase, David. Or Kaz. David said that is a good phrase, paper things over. That's true. Elizabeth, did you want to maybe talk a little bit about Appalachia? Because I know it's tough, because, or not just Appalachia, but go ahead.
Yeah. Am I unmuted? Okay.
No, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, I teach, and like we have a freshman seminar course I teach, and so it's interesting when it comes to our diversity unit, because I'm in Eastern Kentucky and Appalachia, and we don't have a lot of diversity around here. And so I have a document that I can share with the group tomorrow. It's called the Periodic Table of Diversity. You know, what's your diversity formula? And so for every dimension of how you can describe a person, you know, there's different options, and it has little abbreviations in it. So you can kind of write out what your diversity formula is. And also in each dimension, one is bolded. And if you put that together, that's the mythical norm. White, male, married, you know, upper income, professional, well-educated, you know. And so, like, you know, which whites get the most privilege, right? Because, you know, if we talk about privilege, it's like in a group of all white people, they're like, you know, these Appalachian young college students are asking me, well, where's my privilege? Because Appalachian people have been exploited forever, you know? And it's like, well, you know, there's different dimensions to it. So being Appalachian actually is sort of your dimension that sets you apart. We know it's wonderful, but the rest of the world doesn't necessarily view it that way. And to the extent that in the early 20th century, there were forced sterilization programs, and the Kentucky legislature considered it, but it never ruled on it. But the Virginia legislature did. They sterilized poor Appalachians against their knowledge, will, or consent, because they were seen as white trash and lesser people. Our county borders Virginia. You know, this happened just 20 miles away from us, including a case that went all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. You know, so I kind of make them aware of their unknown history, you know, of, you know, how they fit into that whole picture. And I asked them, have you ever taken a senior trip? Because a lot of them will go to like New York or DC. And I'm like, how did, you know, when you toured museums and stuff, you know, how did those people talk to you? They talked to us like we were retarded, you know? And, you know, just because of the way, you know, they talk, right? The accent. And so I'm like, you know, that is your diversity dimension that really stands out to others, especially outside our area, you know? So we kind of use that as a lens to gain some empathy for other people with other characteristics that have their experiences too. Of course, it's not the same thing as being Black, right? But you know, everybody has their challenges, and very few people meet that mythical norm, and they're the extremely privileged class.
Right. That's really, I mean, that's interesting too, that I think a lot of people don't know a lot of history, but it's like what Amar said, is you have to meet people where they are isn't exactly the right phrase I want to use, but you know, have some empathy and understand where they're coming from, and then tailor your message so it's something that they can relate to. And that goes back to the framing, you know, and understanding, when you understand where they're coming from and how they frame everything, that is a doorway to how we can frame things that will fit into their worldview and help them understand each other's. Let's see. Anyone else have their hand raised? Sorry, I can't.
I'm
Go
gonna
ahead, Wes.
I'm gonna raise my hand and pivot because I'm gonna be honest with y'all. I haven't even finished the whole thing because I'm a procrastinator. And then last week's event, I lived in Minneapolis within the last year, and so hit home to me personally. And then professionally, I've always worked within communities, non-white communities. So one part that I did read that I loved is where Lakoff talks about the freedom of education and framing education, and going back to what he talks about in parts 1 and 2 is how taxes are investments, and how we need to continue to invest in public education because public education is so crucial to personal freedom. So just curious to know other people's thoughts on that, especially as maybe your local communities seek to privatize education more and more. So yeah.
Someone else needs to jump in here. Kaz, go ahead.
Okay, so I love that part of the book. I think that is a part of the book that I actually use a lot. Is the framing part of the book that I use a lot, and like the idea being like when I'm talking to conservatives, when I'm trying to bridge that gap, because the idea of government spending could be seen as a bad thing. But if you can then reframe it rather than spending as an investment, and if you can say something along the lines like show or explain how like it pays for itself, and you kind of then you're talking about government spending and you're equating it to how you would manage your own personal funds. And so if you can then talk about, like if you in your own life, you can do something, you can invest your money that you get the money back. You're going to end up making money on that. It would be almost irresponsible for you not to do that, right? That's just the smart, thing to do with your funds. So if you can relate that back to, have use the metaphor as for your personal expenses, then then talk about then for what the government wants to do is invest the money that is going to make money over time. You kind of can you're turning into a more of a math equation than about where you could be different on some of the details of what particularly you are looking to invest. But if you take it as a money thing, and you can show that as a good thing, then yeah, I find that I can get further with that than find that common ground in it being a good investment, and then we can talk about the other detail. Everything else on top of that is just details. So yeah, in terms of education, that's the same way. If you can show how investing in education, again using those terms, investing in education, that we will actually be making more money off of that in the long term. Also, investing in education, I find if you use examples of how for many industries, we have to recruit people from outside of the US because we are not able to properly educate enough people to do those kind of very high paying jobs here in the US. That also is that hits on two things, right? That hits them on in two of their spots. You get to say that you're investing in you're spending money wisely, and like I said, it would be irresponsible not to. and then yeah, you're keeping those industries and everything in America, right? So that helps as well. So it's kind of like, yeah, taking that idea of education and thinking about how it could then speak to people's, what their values are, and kind of where, our values are the same, but yeah, really frame it for their values, and put aside the things that would be a little bit more grating, or that we would disagree on.
Yeah, there was a great conversation there in the chat, Kaz, in response to what you had said, and really, I can't remember who said it, but just talking about is it shoot, and I'm losing my thought. Oh, there it is. Government spending, or is it investment in public structure? So really good conversation, kind of going back. So. Unless anyone else has anything else to talk about the education, I'll be quiet and post what you want to talk about in the chat. We got about 10 minutes left.
Let me look at the chat here. there's a lot of stuff going by. Feel free to raise your hand, whatever. We are.
And by the way, I am a teacher, and a lot of you have been commenting and say you don't want to talk. So sometimes, teachers like to say, okay, what do you think, Stefan, or
He's going to call on you.
Or Michelle, or so. I'd love to hear.
Tracy, go ahead. Hold on. Can you unmute Tracy?
Hi.
Hi, Tracy.
I'm one of the two towns fighting over assessments for the regional high school. We had an Education Reform Act back in the early 90s, which set this statutory reform where towns would be equally assessed for their regional school district. But they continue doing it on the per pupil method. Now, one town is in arrears for $1.5 million, and they're trying to compromise. And the fighting back and forth is who's getting taxed unfairly. They're losing sight of the kids' needs for education. They're looking at having to cut 40 teachers in the school district next year. So it's just getting real.
Yeah, so maybe like, I don't know, if you have friends on the school board or people that are involved, or if you're involved, like start.
Well, I'm kind of forced to be an objective observer because I work at the local newspaper, so I just.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Just trying to get my head around is difficult.
I don't know what your.
I'm just kind of putting out there the things that people are dealing with on the local level. It's like.
Yeah, like maybe start just when you talk about it, just start talking about it as an investment rather than taxes.
I saw the most peculiar sign today. I'm trying to figure out what it meant. It said taxation without education. It's like, what does that mean? what are they saying here? I have to stop in the business and ask them what their sign means because I couldn't understand. Just good.
What was the? So one of the other things that Lakoff talked about in this section was freedom issues. And those of us who were Pete supporters throughout the campaign probably found this section incredibly familiar. And you heard it before. But so many issues, the Republicans have kind of co-opted these terms, freedom and patriotism, and those aren't Republican or conservative terms, and we need to take them back. So framing issues in terms of freedom rather than getting into policy details is one way to do that. Pete liked to say freedom from versus freedom to. But I'm sure there's other progressives and other candidates and other causes or people out there that are doing the same thing. We don't want this to just be about Pete Buttigieg. I mean, yes, he's the one that got a lot of us into this book about framing, but obviously this is a book that's been out there and people use it. So if anyone knows of any others, feel free. Yeah, Elizabeth Warren. She does a great job, especially on the financial and like investment, the taxes, all that stuff. She is amazing at it. Yeah, she's really, really good at it. Yeah, and yeah, David is right. Dems are terrible at talking about taxes. Yeah, and so, I mean, we need to lift up these voices that are trying to frame these things correctly. And it's hard to break through, but as we Lakoff says in the book, as it is repeated, the neurons in our brain start making these connections, and it's something that we have to repeat over and 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 over before it changes. So yes, like peaceful protests. Share that Vox article about thousands of people across the country are protesting peacefully, and that's all they talk about. And global warming, taxes as, like investment in our infrastructure or our education or whatever, instead of taxes as a burden. Taxes, we put money towards our IRA or retirement or whatever. Is that a burden? Or is it an investment? Well, it's an investment. It's the same thing with taxes. So that's just another thing. Like, Thomas, go ahead, and Elizabeth, and oh my gosh, so many people. Okay, so
can you hear me?
Yes, Thomas, go ahead, and then Elizabeth next.
So this is great. Metaphors are wonderful, but I keep asking if the other side is actually playing to an allegory, that it's firmly founded within a religious context that makes a one-by-one metaphorical approach very difficult. So I would be interested in hearing what other people might have to say about that. I used to be a strong conservative, and I am tugged by it all the time. I'm Hispanic. I'm not a white privileged American, but I was raised strongly Catholic, and I was raised within a context that is more allegorical. I like Lord of the Rings, and it was based upon that context. And so I keep asking, are metaphors enough? And can we really push back? Because in my mind, Martin Luther King was allegorical, and he could talk across a broad range of subjects, but still maintain a cohesive line of thought that I don't hear from our side. I like your poster in the back, by the way. So that's why I mentioned Lord of the Rings.
Yeah. I forgot those were back there. I don't know, that first one, you can't see it on this camera because it's so far away, but it's actually signed by all the cast. So.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. So for me, I think that's really interesting that you bring that up. Do we need stories? Do we need more of an overarching allegory or story to connect our message? That's a big question. I'm not sure how to answer that. So, anyone else? What's another word for government handouts? Okay, so Elizabeth, you have thought?
Yeah, with the taxes topic, I got texted by someone from Americans for Prosperity asking me to oppose new gas taxes. And I asked the question, well, what are the gas taxes going to be used for? And he answered, well, road maintenance and improvement. And I answered, I live in the mountains and we have terrible roads, and they can be fatal if you have road subsidence on a mountain road. You go slipping off the mountain. I would be happy to pay gas taxes, higher gas taxes, if it ends up with better roads and fewer deaths. So
what do they say?
Oh, okay. All right, thank you, have a nice day.
Okay, here's the thing. You never know which phone banker's mind you're going to change by framing it that way.
Right.
And
so and Americans for Prosperity is a big Koch brothers,
yeah,
organization, and I know that. So they're going to oppose all taxes and be hyper conservative. And I'm just like, no, this is something I would want. I would gladly pay extra higher gas taxes. We stand to benefit from it.
Right. That's another, just a sort of an aside to that is, I know that a lot of us probably in the past week have been arguing on social media or Facebook or whatever with our friends and family. You may never change their mind, but as long as you keep this framing in the front of your mind when you are talking to them, you never know who's lurking. You never know who's listening and reading those posts, and you may never hear from them, but you might change their mind. And you might hear from them and say, I get DMs sometimes where it's like, I know I don't comment on your posts, but I really like what you said about whatever. I think that's a really good way to put it. Or I never thought about it that way before. You never know who's listening. So I know it's really easy to say, oh, I'm just going to quit Facebook. I'm going to quit Twitter. I'm not going to talk about it anymore. I'm tired. I'm not going to don't give up, because there are people listening that you don't know they're listening. And if you're putting out the example of being the rational person who's framing things well against the person who's, conspiracy theories or whatever, they're going to notice that. And it's going to make an impression. And it may not change their mind right away, but maybe they'll remember it, and I think every talk and argue, whatever, I think that's it can be constructive if you do it the right way and if you stay calm and rational.
All
yes.
right. Well,
go ahead, Wes.
9:02, and we want to honor people's time and commitments to the rest of your lives beyond this book club. So thank you. We really hope we added this extra piece for the hope to continue the discussion and dialogue, because there's so much richness in Lakoff's work. And so we will be sure to highlight some of those links shared in the chat. And then I think we will actually just provide the whole chat. I got to see how that all works, but try to provide a lot of those links that you all shared. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well, as those are great ways to share those ideas. And then lastly, again, we want to invite you to join us on Thursday night, starting at 8 o'clock Eastern. Again, I'm going to put that link in the chat for our discussion on how to talk progressive politics. So thank you all so much. And
one more thing.
End us, and then we'll close our night.
Okay, so one more thing. Wes mentioned next week is the last week of our chat or discussion of this book. We have Megan Hunt, who is a Nebraska state senator. And we may have a second special guest. I'm not sure yet, but keep that in mind. We're working on it. We're working on it behind the scenes. So please join us, and we will try to wrap up our discussions So we might have another session the next week. We're still talking about that. It depends on how it goes. So, so yeah, have a great night. Thank you for coming. Stay safe. I know that a lot of you live in cities where things are going crazy. Please stay safe and stay motivated. Have a great night. Thank you for coming.